Welcome back to the channel, and today we are diving deep into one of the most iconic romantic comedies ever made. We are talking about Pretty Woman, the 1990 classic that changed Hollywood forever, turned its lead actress into a global superstar, and gave the world a love story that people are still watching and talking about more than 3 decades later. So sit back, relax, and let us get into everything you need to know about this legendary film. Overview. Pretty Woman is an American romantic comedy film that was released in the year 1990. The film was produced by Touchstone Pictures, which is a division of the Walt Disney Company, and it was distributed by Buena Vista Pictures. The movie was directed by Garry Marshall, who was already a well-known name in Hollywood for his work in television and film. The screenplay was written by J.F. Lawton. The film was produced by Arnon Milchan and Stephen Ruther. Pretty Woman was made in the United States of America and carries with it the classic charm of Hollywood filmmaking from that golden era of the late 1980s and early 1990s. The movie is set primarily in the city of Los Angeles, California, which plays a very significant role in shaping the tone, the atmosphere, and the entire narrative of the story. The film had an estimated production budget of around $14 million and went on to become one of the highest-grossing films of 1990, earning over $463 million at the worldwide box office. That kind of success at that budget level was extraordinary and cemented the film as one of the greatest commercial successes in the romantic comedy genre. The film runs for approximately 119 minutes and carries an R rating in the United States due to some mature content and adult themes. Plot details. The story of Pretty Woman begins in the bustling and glamorous city of Los Angeles. Edward Lewis, a very wealthy and powerful New York businessman, is in Los Angeles on a business trip. Edward is a corporate raider, meaning his profession involves buying struggling companies, breaking them apart, and selling their pieces for profit. He is extremely successful financially, but his personal life is a mess. He is cold, emotionally detached, and has just ended a relationship with his girlfriend over the phone. One night, after borrowing his lawyer's car, Edward gets lost on Hollywood Boulevard while trying to navigate his way back to his hotel, the Regent Beverly Wilshire. On the street, he encounters a young woman named Vivian Ward, who is a street-smart sex worker living in a small apartment on Hollywood Boulevard with her roommate and friend Kit DeLuca. Vivian is lively, outspoken, funny, and full of personality despite her difficult circumstances. Edward stops and asks her for directions, and the two quickly develop a natural and easy rapport. Edward offers to pay Vivian to spend the night with him at his hotel, and she agrees. The next morning, Edward is impressed by Vivian's personality, her wit, and her refreshing honesty. Unlike the people who typically surround him in his professional world, Vivian says exactly what she thinks and does not pretend to be someone she is not. Edward makes her an unusual business proposition. He asks her to stay with him for the entire week, accompany him to social engagements, and act as his companion, for which he will pay her $3,000. Vivian, seeing this as a great financial opportunity and a way to get off the streets, agrees to the arrangement. What follows is a transformation story at its heart. Vivian is taken to high-end shops on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills so that she can be dressed appropriately for the events she will attend with Edward. However, when she first walks into the boutiques on her own, the staff treat her rudely and refuse to assist her because of how she looks and is dressed. This leads to one of the most memorable and celebrated moments in the film. Edward later accompanies her and the staff's entire attitude changes completely, and Vivian gets to enjoy a luxurious shopping experience. She is transformed outwardly through expensive clothing and jewelry, but throughout all of this her core personality never changes, and that is precisely what makes her so appealing. As the week progresses, Edward and Vivian begin spending more and more time together. They attend the opera in San Francisco, they have elegant dinners, and they engage in long conversations that reveal a great deal about both of their characters. Vivian turns out to be intelligent, sensitive, and emotionally aware. She dreams of a better life and wants to finish her education. Edward, meanwhile, begins to open up emotionally for the first time in years. He starts questioning whether his way of doing business is truly meaningful or fulfilling. He is also involved in an important business deal during this time with a man named James Morse, who is the elderly owner of a shipbuilding company that Edward intends to take over. Through his interactions with Vivian and with James Morse, Edward begins to reconsider his values and his approach to life. The relationship between Edward and Vivian deepens in ways neither of them anticipated. Feelings begin to develop that go far beyond their original business arrangement. However, the reality of their situation and the social gap between them also creates tension and complications. Edward's lawyer, Philip Stuckey, treats Vivian disrespectfully and makes a dangerous and disturbing advance toward her near the end of the film, which is a pivotal and tense moment in the story. Edward is furious and confronts Philip, which shows how much Vivian has come to mean to him. As the week comes to an end, Edward offers Vivian a different kind of arrangement, one where he would set her up in an apartment and continue to see her. Vivian refuses because she realizes she wants more than that. She wants to be valued fully as a person, not just kept as a luxury. She packs up and tells Edward she is going back to her life, planning eventually to get her high school diploma and build a better future. Edward, realizing he is deeply in love with her and that his feelings have fundamentally changed him, makes a grand and romantic gesture, going to her with flowers and climbing a fire escape to reach her despite his fear of heights, telling her he wants to give her a real relationship. The film ends on this beautiful and hopeful note, suggesting that both characters will move forward together, and that love truly has the power to change people for the better. Cast. The film features an extraordinary cast that delivered performances audiences have never forgotten. Richard Gere plays the role of Edward Lewis. Gere was already a major Hollywood star at the time of this film, known for his roles in American Gigolo and An Officer and a Gentleman. His portrayal of Edward is charming, reserved, and deeply layered. He brings a quiet intensity to the role that perfectly balances Julia Roberts' electric energy on screen. Julia Roberts plays Vivian Ward, and her performance in this film is nothing short of legendary. Roberts was a relatively young actress at the time, and Pretty Woman made her one of the biggest stars in the world overnight. Her smile, her laugh, her warmth, and her comedic timing are all on full display in this film. She brings enormous life and depth to Vivian, making the character completely believable, lovable, and real. Julia Roberts received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress for this role and won a Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a Motion Picture Comedy or Musical. Hector Elizondo plays Barney Thompson, the manager of the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel. His performance is one of the most warmly remembered in the entire film. He acts as a kind and supportive figure to Vivian, helping her navigate the unfamiliar world of luxury and elegance. Hector Elizondo has appeared in every single Garry Marshall film, and his role here is one of his finest. Laura San Giacomo plays Kit DeLuca, Vivian's best friend and roommate. She brings tremendous energy and humor to the role and provides important grounding for Vivian's character and backstory. Jason Alexander plays Philip Stuckey, Edward's manipulative and morally compromised lawyer, and delivers a convincing and unsettling performance in the film's more tense moments. Alex Hyde White plays David Morse, the son of the businessman James Morse, and Eleanor Donahue, Amy Yaspek, and several others fill out the supporting cast in memorable ways. Release date and box office. Pretty Woman was officially released in the United States on March 23, 1990. The film opened to wide release across America and quickly became a massive cultural phenomenon. It opened at number 1 at the box office and remained one of the top-performing films for weeks. As mentioned earlier, the film earned over $463 million globally against a modest production budget of approximately $14 million. This made it one of the most profitable films of 1990 and one of the most successful romantic comedies in the entire history of Hollywood. The film was released internationally throughout 1990 as well, where it received equally enthusiastic responses from audiences around the world. Trailer and marketing. The marketing campaign for Pretty Woman was built around the chemistry between Richard Gere and Julia Roberts, which was undeniable and impossible to ignore. The trailers highlighted the fairy tale quality of the story, the glamour of the Los Angeles setting, the beautiful costumes, and the central romance. The promotional material positioned the film as a modern Cinderella story set in the world of wealth and luxury, and that framing resonated enormously with audiences everywhere. The film's poster, featuring Julia Roberts in a white and red polka dot dress, became one of the most iconic movie posters of its era. Music and cultural impact. The soundtrack of the film played a significant role in its success and cultural lasting power. The music Pretty Woman went on to become a cultural touchstone of its generation. It sparked enormous conversations about class, love, transformation, and human dignity. It launched Julia Roberts to superstardom and reinvigorated Richard Gere's career. It defined the romantic comedy genre for years to come and set a standard that countless films have tried to match. The film was selected by the American Film Institute in various rankings and has maintained its status as one of the great Hollywood films of modern times. It inspired a long-running Broadway musical adaptation that opened in 2018, further proving that the story and its characters have a timeless quality that continues to speak to audiences across generations. Legacy. More than 30 years after its release, Pretty Woman remains one of the most beloved and re-watched films in cinema history. It is regularly featured in lists of the greatest romantic comedies ever made. It is studied in film schools for its storytelling, its use of setting, and its performances. Julia Roberts' Vivian Ward is considered one of the all-time great romantic comedy characters, and Richard Gere's Edward Lewis is equally iconic. Director Garry Marshall delivered what is arguably the defining work of his career with this film, and it stands as a monument to the power of a simple, well-told love story that believes in the goodness of people and the possibility of change. Pretty Woman, 1990, complete story. The story of Pretty Woman begins on a warm evening in the sprawling, glittering city of Los Angeles, California. The city itself feels alive with contrast. On one side of it, there is unimaginable wealth, luxury hotels, private jets, and business deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. On the other side, there are streets lined with people who are simply trying to survive, people who have fallen through the cracks of society, and who wake up every day without knowing exactly how things are going to turn out. It is in this city of contrast that our story takes place, and it is this city that becomes the backdrop for one of the most unexpected and beautiful love stories ever put on film. We are introduced first to Edward Lewis, a man who, by every external measure, has achieved everything the world says a person should want. He is enormously wealthy. He runs his own company out of New York. He wears expensive suits, stays in the finest hotels, and moves through the world with the kind of quiet authority that only real money can buy. Edward is what is known as a corporate raider. His business model is built on identifying large companies that are struggling financially, purchasing them at a reduced value, breaking them apart piece by piece, and selling off the individual assets for profit. He does not build things. He dismantles them. And he has made a fortune doing exactly that. But beneath all of that financial success and professional power, Edward Lewis is a deeply lonely and emotionally empty man. He has never learned how to truly connect with another person. He keeps everyone at a distance. He is guarded, cold, and transactional in almost every relationship in his life, whether professional or personal. As the story opens, Edward is in Los Angeles for a very important business deal. He is in the process of attempting a hostile takeover of a large shipbuilding company owned by a man named James Morse, an elderly, proud, an honorable businessman who built his company from the ground up over the course of decades. Edward does not know James Morse personally at this point, and he does not particularly care about him as a human being. To Edward, he is simply the owner of an asset that can be profitably dismantled. Edward has come to Los Angeles to finalize the details of this acquisition, and his lawyer, Philip Stuckey, is handling much of the legal and financial groundwork. Philip is a sharp, calculating, and morally flexible man who has worked alongside Edward for years and who shares Edward's detached and often ruthless approach to business and to people. On the very first night of his stay in Los Angeles, Edward has an argument over the phone with his girlfriend, and the relationship ends. He is not devastated. He is barely affected. This in itself tells us a great deal about the emotional state Edward is living in. After the call, restless and alone, he decides to go for a drive. He borrows his lawyer Philip's car, a sleek and expensive vehicle, and sets off into the Los Angeles night. However, Edward is not familiar with the city and quickly becomes lost. He finds himself driving along Hollywood Boulevard, far from the comfort and familiarity of his luxury hotel. It is here, on the streets of Hollywood Boulevard, that he first encounters Vivian Ward. Vivian Ward is a young woman in her mid-20s who works as a street-level sex worker on Hollywood Boulevard. She shares a small, cramped apartment with her best friend and roommate, a woman named Kit DeLuca. Kit is street-smart, sharp-tongued, funny, and fiercely loyal to Vivian. The two of them look out for each other in a world that does not always look out for them. Vivian's life is not glamorous. She and Kit are behind on their rent. They scrape together money in whatever ways they can. Vivian has dreams and intelligence that her circumstances have never given her the opportunity to fully express. She is not defined by her profession. She is a full and complex human being who happens to be living a very difficult life in a very unforgiving city. When Edward pulls his borrowed car alongside her on Hollywood Boulevard, confused and looking for directions, Vivian spots him immediately. She sees a wealthy man in an expensive car and she sees a potential client. She leans into the window and offers to help him find his way for a fee. Edward is direct and businesslike. He is not looking for her usual services. He simply needs directions back to the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills. Vivian agrees to direct him, but under one condition, that he lets her ride in the car and show him the way herself. Edward agrees, and the two of them drive off together through the Los Angeles night. What happens in that car ride is the foundation of everything that follows. Edward and Vivian talk. They are easy with each other in a way that surprises them both. Vivian is completely unimpressed by Edward's wealth and status. She does not treat him with the deference or the awe that most people in his world show him. She teases him, challenges him, and laughs freely, and something about her complete lack of pretense genuinely fascinates him. By the time they arrive at the Regent Beverly Wilshire, Edward has already decided he wants to spend more time with her. He invites her up to his hotel suite, and Vivian, recognizing this as a business opportunity, negotiates a fee and agrees. They spend the night together, and the next morning, rather than things feeling awkward or transactional, there is a warmth and an ease between them that neither of them expected. Vivian, unused to the extraordinary luxury of the hotel suite, wanders around in wide-eyed delight. She orders a massive room service breakfast and eats enthusiastically and without any self-consciousness. She is completely herself, and Edward watches her with growing interest and amusement. She does not perform for him. She does not try to be anything other than exactly who she is, and for a man who lives in a world of performance and pretense, this is remarkable. Edward has a business week of social engagements ahead of him, dinners, meetings, events, all of which typically require him to bring a companion. He makes Vivian a proposition. He offers to pay her $3,000 to stay with him for the entire week, to accompany him to his events, to be his companion in every sense of the word. For Vivian, $3,000 is an enormous sum, more money than she would see in a very long time. She negotiates confidently, asks for clarity on what is expected, sets her own terms, and agrees to the arrangement. It is, as both of them acknowledge quite openly, a business deal. Nothing more, or at least that is how it begins. The first major challenge of the week becomes immediately apparent. Vivian has no appropriate clothing for the world she is about to enter. Edward gives her his credit card and sends her to the high-end boutiques on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. Vivian walks into one of these pristine, beautifully appointed shops dressed in her Hollywood Boulevard clothes and is immediately and ruthlessly judged by the sales staff. The women working there look at her with barely concealed contempt. They do not help her. They make it very clear that she is not the kind of customer they serve. Vivian, stung and embarrassed, leaves the shop without buying anything and returns to the hotel. When she tells Edward what happened, he accompanies her back to Rodeo Drive himself the following day. His presence changes everything entirely. The moment the sales staff recognize that Vivian is with a man of Edward's obvious wealth and authority, their attitude transforms completely. They fall over themselves to assist her. Vivian gets to experience the full luxury of being a highly valued customer. She tries on beautiful dresses, elegant shoes, and finds herself transformed outwardly into someone who could walk into any room in the world and belong there. She embraces the experience with joy and humor and genuine delight, and Edward watches this transformation with something that is beginning to feel a great deal like affection. That afternoon, Vivian goes back to Rodeo Drive on her own, fully dressed in her new clothes, carrying shopping bags from the most exclusive stores on the street, and she walks back into the boutique that had refused to help her the day before. She stands in front of the women who had treated her so dismissively, and she reminds them of that interaction. She tells them, pleasantly but pointedly, that they have made a very big mistake, and then she walks back out, shopping bags in hand, with her head held high. It is one of the most satisfying and celebrated moments in the entire film, and the audience feels every bit of the triumph along with her. Back at the hotel, Vivian is introduced to Barney Thompson, the manager of the Regent Beverly Wilshire. Barney is a warm, dignified, and perceptive man who sees immediately that Vivian is in an unusual situation but treats her with nothing but courtesy and kindness. He becomes something of a quiet guide and ally for her throughout the week, teaching her which fork to use at a formal dinner, explaining the customs and codes of the world she is temporarily inhabiting, and doing all of this without ever making her feel small or inadequate. His gentleness toward her is one of the emotional heartbeats of the film. As the week progresses, Edward and Vivian spend an increasing amount of genuine time together. One of the most beautiful sequences in the film involves Edward surprising Vivian with a private jet trip to San Francisco to attend the opera. Vivian has never been to the opera before. She has no idea what to expect. But when the music begins, something in it moves her deeply and unexpectedly. She is completely transported by the performance, emotionally overwhelmed by the beauty of what she is hearing and seeing. Tears come to her eyes. Edward watches her face during the performance, and sees something he has never quite seen before, a person experiencing something for the very first time with their whole heart wide open. It moves him in ways he cannot fully explain, but the experience plants something in him, a seed of feeling that has not been there in a very long time. They have dinner together. They talk about their lives. Vivian tells Edward about where she came from, about the difficulties of her childhood, about the circumstances that led her to the life she is living on Hollywood Boulevard. She is honest without being self-pitying. She is clear-eyed about her situation and about her own choices. She tells Edward that she wants to eventually get her high school diploma, that she has dreams of a different kind of life, and that she knows she is capable of more than what she has been allowed to become. Edward listens. He really listens, which is perhaps the first time in a long time that someone has listened to her without judgment. In turn, Vivian asks Edward about himself, about his childhood, about why he does what he does for a living. Edward opens up, slowly and guardedly at first, but eventually with real honesty. He tells her about his father, about the complicated and painful relationship he had with him, about how much of what drives him professionally is rooted in unresolved anger and hurt from his past. He has never said these things out loud to anyone before. The act of saying them, of being genuinely heard by someone who is not interested in his money or his power, is quietly transformative for him. Meanwhile, Edward's business dealings continue throughout the week. He is in negotiations to complete the hostile takeover of James Morse's shipbuilding company. At one of his social events during the week, James Morse and his adult son David are also in attendance, and Edward brings Vivian with him. What Edward does not anticipate is that Vivian and James Morse will genuinely connect with each other. James Morse is a warm, old-fashioned, honorable man who built his company through decades of hard work and who cares deeply about the people who work for him. He and Vivian talk easily and warmly, and there is a natural chemistry of respect between them. Watching this interaction affects Edward. Seeing James Morse as a real human being through Vivian's eyes, seeing the genuine affection and pride the old man has for what he built, begins to change something in Edward's thinking about the acquisition. He begins to question whether dismantling a company that represents a man's life's work and the livelihoods of hundreds of workers is really something he can continue to feel good about. This is not a moral crisis that resolves itself immediately, but the seed of doubt is planted, and it grows throughout the remainder of the week. As the week continues and the days pass, both Edward and Vivian find themselves in increasingly difficult emotional territory. The business arrangement they agreed to at the beginning of the week is no longer feeling purely like business. They are becoming genuinely close. There are moments of laughter, of tenderness, of real intimacy that goes far beyond the terms of any financial arrangement. Edward buys Vivian a spectacular diamond and ruby necklace to wear to one of his formal events, and the moment when he snaps the jewelry box shut on her fingers as a playful joke is one of the most charming and genuinely funny moments in the film. Their laughter together is easy and real. They are comfortable with each other in a way that surprises them both. But there is also tension because the reality of their situation does not go away. Vivian is acutely aware that she is still a sex worker from Hollywood Boulevard. She is aware of how the world sees her. She is aware that Philip Stuckey, Edward's lawyer, looks at her with contempt and treats her as nothing more than an expensive accessory that Edward has temporarily hired. Philip is dismissive of her, condescending, and entirely unable to see her as a person deserving of respect. Edward notices this but does not immediately address it, and the tension simmers beneath the surface of the week. Things come to a head in a very frightening and important scene near the end of the film. Philip comes to the hotel suite while Edward is away. He has been drinking and his already thin veneer of professional courtesy strips away entirely. He makes a violent and threatening advance toward Vivian, treating her as though her profession means she has no rights, no right to refuse him, no right to be treated with dignity. Vivian, terrified, fights back. When Edward returns and discovers what has happened, he is furious in a way that reveals exactly how deep his feelings for Vivian have grown. He confronts Philip with genuine anger, not the cold, calculated business anger we might have seen from him at the beginning of the film, but real human fury born from caring about someone who has been hurt. He fires Philip on the spot and ends their professional relationship entirely. This moment marks a turning point for Edward in more ways than one. In the days that follow, he also makes a decision about the James Morse acquisition. Rather than proceeding with the hostile takeover and dismantling the company, he goes to James Morse with a different proposition. He offers to partner with the older man and help rebuild the company and grow it together, rather than tear it apart for profit. It is a completely different way of doing business, one built on creation rather than destruction, and the change reflects the transformation that Vivian has quietly brought about in him simply by being herself. As the week draws to its close, Edward makes an offer to Vivian. He tells her he wants to set her up in an apartment in Los Angeles. He will pay her rent, give her money, and continue to see her when he is in the city. He frames it as a generous offer, and by any financial measure it is. But Vivian hears what is underneath it. She is being offered the role of a kept woman, a luxurious but limited arrangement that would still define her entirely in terms of what she provides for a man. It is a nicer version of the life she is already living. It is not the life she wants, and it is not the life she deserves. Vivian refuses. Quietly, firmly, and with complete dignity, she tells Edward that she wants more than that. She tells him that she wants the fairy tale. Not the apartment and the money. The real thing. A real relationship built on real love and real respect. She tells him she knows what she is worth, and she is not willing to settle for less than that. And then, with her heart clearly breaking because she has genuinely fallen in love with him, she packs her bags. She plans to leave Los Angeles, go back to her life, and eventually follow through on her plan to get her diploma and build something better for herself. Edward is left in the hotel suite, stunned and alone, faced with the reality of what is happening. And it is here that everything crystallizes for him. He realizes that he loves her. Not in the comfortable, manageable way he has allowed himself to feel things before, but deeply and truly and without reservation. He realizes that she has changed him, that the week he spent with her has shifted something fundamental in how he sees the world and how he sees himself. He realizes that he does not want to go back to the life he was living before he found her on Hollywood Boulevard. So Edward does something that is almost entirely out of character for him. He does something completely impractical and emotionally vulnerable. He buys flowers. He gets into a limousine. And he goes to find Vivian at the small apartment building on Hollywood Boulevard where she lives. He gets out of the limousine with his bouquet of flowers and he stands in the street looking up at her building. There is just one problem. Edward has a lifelong and genuine fear of heights. He is terrified of them. The staircase leading up to Vivian's apartment is an external fire escape, metal and open to the air, several stories above the ground. In any other circumstance, Edward would not go near it. But love, it turns out, is more powerful than fear, and Edward begins to climb. He climbs one step at a time, holding tightly to the railing, fighting his fear with every step, with his flowers in one hand and his heart in his mouth. And he reaches the top and he reaches Vivian. When Vivian sees him there, having climbed to her despite everything, she breaks into the most beautiful and radiant smile. He tells her that he wants to give her the fairy tale too. He tells her that she saved him. And she, laughing and crying at the same time in the way that only the happiest and most overwhelming moments in life can make a person feel, reaches down to him. And the film closes on this image, the two of them together at the top of that fire escape in Hollywood, with Los Angeles spread out around them, a city of contrasts and dreams and second chances, while a voice tells us that once upon a time, a princess rescued a prince. And that is the complete and full story of Pretty Woman, a film that endures because it believes, without any apology or hesitation, in the power of love to change people, in the worth and dignity of every human being regardless of where they come from or what they have done, and in the very human and universal longing to be truly seen and valued for exactly who you are. Pretty Woman, 1990, actor's life history in full detail. Richard Gere. Richard Tiffany Gere was born on August 31, 1949, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He grew up in a middle-class family in Syracuse, New York, where he was raised alongside his four siblings. His father, Homer George Gere, worked as an insurance agent, and his mother, Doris Ann, was a homemaker. Richard grew up in a Methodist household and was raised with strong traditional values. From a very young age, he showed an interest in the arts and music. He was a gifted musician as a child, learning to play several instruments including the trumpet, guitar, and piano. Music was his first serious passion, and for a time it seemed like that might be the direction his life would take. He attended the University of Massachusetts Amherst on a gymnastics scholarship, which speaks to his extraordinary physical discipline and athleticism from a young age. He studied philosophy at university but left before completing his degree, feeling the pull of the performing arts too strongly to ignore. He moved to Provincetown, Massachusetts, where he began working in theater, taking on small roles and learning the craft of performance from the ground up. He then made his way to New York City, which was the beating heart of American theater at the time, and began working in off-Broadway productions. He lived the life of a struggling young actor in New York, taking whatever work he could find, honing his skills, and building his reputation slowly but steadily. His early theater work caught the attention of people in the industry, and he eventually made his way to London, where he appeared in the original West End production of Grease. This was a significant moment in his early career, giving him exposure to a much larger audience and demonstrating his range as a performer. He returned to New York and continued building his theatrical credentials while also beginning to pursue film work. His early film appearances in the mid-1970s were small but showed that the camera responded to him in a unique and powerful way. There was something magnetic about Richard Gere on screen, a combination of physical presence, quiet intensity, and an underlying sensitivity that made him impossible to ignore. His breakthrough in film came with the 1977 movie Looking for Mr. Goodbar, in which he had a supporting role. The film starred Diane Keaton and was a dark and serious drama, and Gere's performance was noticed by critics and audiences alike. But it was his role in the 1978 film Days of Heaven, directed by Terrence Malick, that truly announced him as a serious cinematic force. The film was visually stunning and critically acclaimed, and Gere held his own against the extraordinarily high artistic standards of Malick's direction. The role that made Richard Gere a genuine star, however, was his performance in American Gigolo in 1980. In this film, he played Julian Kay, a high-end male escort in Los Angeles, and the role required him to be on screen in a way that was almost uncomfortably intimate and exposed. He delivered a performance of extraordinary confidence and vulnerability, and the film became a massive commercial success. It also established him as one of the most undeniably attractive and charismatic leading men in Hollywood. Women around the world responded to him with enormous enthusiasm, and he became one of the defining sex symbols of his generation. His follow-up to American Gigolo was the 1982 film An Officer and a Gentleman, directed by Taylor Hackford and co-starring Deborah Winger. This film became one of the biggest hits of that year and contains one of the most iconic closing scenes in the history of romantic cinema, where Gere's character walks into a factory in his naval dress uniform and sweeps Deborah Winger's character off her feet in front of all her coworkers. The image became permanently embedded in popular culture. The film earned numerous award nominations and cemented Gere's status as one of Hollywood's top leading men. Through the mid-1980s, Gere continued to work steadily in Hollywood, though some of his films during this period were less commercially successful. He took risks, choosing roles that challenged him artistically rather than simply playing it safe. He appeared in films like Breathless, The Cotton Club, and No Mercy, each of which showed different dimensions of his abilities as a performer. He also became increasingly involved in activism and humanitarian causes during this period, particularly around issues related to Tibet and the Dalai Lama. He had converted to Tibetan Buddhism in the early 1980s, and his faith became a central and defining part of his life, shaping his values, his priorities, and his public persona. By the late 1980s, Gere's career was at something of a crossroads. He had not had a massive commercial hit in several years, and there were questions in Hollywood about whether his moment had passed. Then came Pretty Woman in 1990, and everything changed. The film was a phenomenon, and Gere's chemistry with Julia Roberts was something that audiences absolutely could not get enough of. His understated, slightly reserved but deeply warm portrayal of Edward Lewis was the perfect counterpoint to Roberts' explosive energy, and the film made both of them even bigger stars than they already were. After Pretty Woman, Gere continued to deliver strong performances across a wide range of films. He starred in Summersby in 1993, in Intersection in 1994, and then delivered one of his most critically celebrated performances in the 1996 thriller Primal Fear, playing a defense attorney opposite Edward Norton, who was making his film debut in that movie. The film was a major hit, and reminded audiences and critics of the full depth of Gere's abilities. He then starred in the 2000 film Drive T and the Women, directed by Robert Altman, and delivered a wonderfully nuanced performance. One of the defining moments of the later phase of his career came in 2002 with the musical film Chicago, in which he played Billy Flynn, a slick and charismatic defense lawyer. Gere had not made a musical since his stage days, and many people were skeptical about whether he could pull it off. He proved every skeptic spectacularly wrong. He sang, he danced, he charmed, and he was absolutely electrifying on screen. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and Gere's performance was one of its great pleasures. In his personal life, Gere has been married 3 times. His first marriage was to supermodel Cindy Crawford in 1991, one of the most celebrated and discussed celebrity unions of that era. The couple divorced in 1994. He later married actress and activist Carrie Lowell in 2002, and they have a son together named Homer James Jigme Gere, born in 2000. That marriage ended in divorce after a lengthy legal process. In 2018, Gere married Spanish activist and journalist Alejandra Silva, and the couple have 2 sons together. He has spoken openly and warmly about how his later family life has brought him a sense of peace and happiness. Throughout his life, Richard Gere has remained one of the most committed celebrity advocates for Tibetan independence and Buddhist causes in the world. He has spoken at international forums, met with world leaders, and used his platform consistently and fearlessly in service of causes he believes in. He has been blacklisted from working with certain international studios and distributors because of his outspoken support for Tibetan rights, but he has never backed down or moderated his views for the sake of commercial opportunity. He has also been deeply involved in HIV and AIDS awareness campaigns for decades and has supported numerous humanitarian organizations globally. Julia Roberts. Julia Fiona Roberts was born on October 28, 1967, in Smyrna, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta. She was the 3rd child of Walter Grady Roberts and Betty Lou Bredemus, both of whom were involved in the arts. Her parents ran an acting school in Atlanta, and the home she grew up in was one where creativity, performance, and storytelling were always present. Her older siblings are Eric Roberts, who became a well-known actor in his own right, and Lisa Roberts Gillen, who also pursued work in the entertainment industry. The Roberts children grew up in a household where artistic ambition was understood and encouraged. Her early childhood was not without difficulty. Her parents divorced when Julia was 4 years old, and the experience of growing up in a broken home left marks on her that she has spoken about honestly throughout her life. Her mother remarried, and Julia grew up splitting time between her mother and stepfather. She attended school in Georgia and was remembered by those who knew her as a bright, vivacious, and deeply likable young person. She was not immediately identified as someone who was destined for stardom. She was simply a girl with a big smile, a big laugh, and an unusual amount of natural warmth. After high school, Julia moved to New York City to pursue an acting career. She was 18 years old when she arrived in New York, and she had very little money and no significant connections in the industry. She began taking acting classes, going to auditions, and doing whatever work she could find. She modeled briefly during this period, though it was never her passion. Acting was always the goal. She signed with a talent agency and began auditioning for film and television roles, and it was not long before she started getting noticed. Her film debut came in 1987 in a low-budget film called Satisfaction, in which she played a young musician. The film was not a significant success, but it gave Julia her first experience in front of a film camera, and she learned from it. She appeared in several more films in the late 1980s, gradually building her body of work and her reputation. She appeared in Mystic Pizza in 1988, a film that also featured a young Matt Damon in a tiny early role. Julia's performance in Mystic Pizza was warmly received and helped establish her as a talent worth watching. Then came Steel Magnolias in 1989, directed by Herbert Ross and featuring an extraordinary ensemble cast that included Sally Field, Shirley MacLaine, Olympia Dukakis, Dolly Parton, and Daryl Hannah. Julia played Shelby, a young Southern woman with diabetes who is determined to live her life on her own terms despite her illness. The role required her to carry enormous emotional weight, including some very dramatic and heartbreaking scenes, and she delivered a performance that left audiences and critics absolutely stunned. She received her first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress for this role, and overnight the entire industry understood that Julia Roberts was something genuinely special. And then came Pretty Woman in 1990, and the world changed completely. The film was made for approximately $14 million and earned over $463 million worldwide, and Julia Roberts was at the absolute center of every moment of its success. Her portrayal of Vivian Ward was a revelation. She was funny, she was warm, she was heartbreaking, she was joyful, and she was utterly and completely believable in every single moment. The famous scene where she laughs at the opera, the scene on Rodeo Drive, the scene where she sits on the hotel bed eating strawberries and watching old movies, the scene at the very end where she reaches down from the fire escape, all of it was performed with a naturalness and a radiance that is almost impossible to manufacture. You cannot teach someone to be Julia Roberts on screen. It is simply who she is. The film made her one of the most famous people on the planet. Her face was on the cover of every major magazine. She was awarded the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Comedy or Musical for her performance, and she received her second Academy Award nomination. She was paid $3 million for Pretty Woman, which at the time made her one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood, and her salary only continued to rise from there. The early 1990s were a period of enormous professional success for Julia Roberts, but also significant personal turbulence. She was engaged to actor Kiefer Sutherland, and the two had a very public relationship that ended dramatically when Julia called off the engagement just days before the wedding in 1991. She then had a whirlwind relationship and marriage to singer Lyle Lovett, whom she married in 1993 after a very short courtship. The marriage surprised almost everyone who knew them both and equally surprised the public. The couple divorced in 1995, and Julia spoke later about how that period of her personal life was defined by a great deal of searching and confusion about who she was outside of her professional identity. Professionally, however, she continued to deliver major performances. She starred in The Pelican Brief in 1993 alongside Denzel Washington, in I Love Trouble in 1994 with Nick Nolte, and in Mary Riley in 1996. She then delivered one of her most beloved performances in My Best Friend's Wedding in 1997, playing a woman who realizes she is in love with her best friend on the eve of his wedding to someone else. The film was a massive hit and showed that Roberts' particular combination of humor, warmth, and emotional intelligence was absolutely timeless. The role that brought her the ultimate professional recognition of her career came in 2000 with Erin Brockovich, directed by Steven Soderbergh. Roberts played the real-life Erin Brockovich, a legally untrained woman who helped build a major case against a California power company that had been contaminating the water supply of a small town and devastating the health of its residents. The role required Roberts to completely inhabit a real person, to carry a film almost entirely on her own shoulders, and to bring both ferocious energy and profound humanity to every scene. She was extraordinary. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress for this role, becoming one of the most celebrated actresses of her generation. She was paid $20 million for the film, making her the first actress in history to receive that salary. In her personal life, Julia Roberts found lasting happiness when she married cinematographer Daniel Moder in 2002. They met on the set of the film The Mexican in 2000, and their relationship sparked considerable public interest as Daniel was married at the time and their relationship began during the process of his divorce. Julia and Daniel have been together ever since and are widely regarded as one of the most stable and genuinely happy couples in Hollywood. They have 3 children together, twins Hazel Patricia and Phineas Walter, born in 2004, and their son Henry Daniel, born in 2007. Julia has spoken many times about how her family is the center of her life and the source of her greatest joy. Throughout her career, Julia Roberts has starred in some of the most beloved and successful films ever made. She appeared in Ocean's 11 in 2001 and its sequels, in Closer in 2004, for which she received significant critical praise for a dramatically darker performance than audiences were used to from her, in Charlie Wilson's War in 2007, and in Eat, Pray, Love in 2010. She has continued to work steadily and has shown remarkable range across comedy, drama, and thriller genres. She remains one of the most recognizable and beloved figures in the history of cinema. Hector Elizondo. Hector Elizondo was born on December 22, 1936, in New York City. He was born and raised in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan, one of the most vibrant and tough neighborhoods in New York City at that time. His parents were of Puerto Rican and Basque descent, and Hector grew up in a community that was rich in culture, family loyalty, and the particular resilience that comes from navigating life in a city that does not make things easy. He grew up speaking Spanish at home and was deeply connected to his cultural roots throughout his life. Before he became an actor, Hector Elizondo worked a series of physically demanding jobs to support himself. He worked as a postal clerk, as a factory worker, and spent time working other blue-collar jobs in New York. He also had a serious and dedicated interest in classical ballet, which he studied formally. This is a fact that surprises many people who know him primarily as a character actor, but it speaks to the depth of his artistic engagement. He later shifted his focus to acting and began studying the craft seriously, attending classes and workshops and dedicating himself to the discipline of performance with the same seriousness he had brought to his physical training. He began his career in theater in New York, appearing in off-Broadway productions and building his skills and his reputation over years of consistent work. He eventually made it to Broadway and established himself as a highly regarded stage actor before making his move into film and television. His ability to bring complete authenticity and emotional depth to every role he played made him one of the most sought-after character actors in the business. Hector Elizondo is perhaps best known for his extraordinarily long and loyal collaboration with director Garry Marshall. He appeared in every single film that Garry Marshall ever directed, a streak of loyalty and collaboration that is almost without parallel in Hollywood history. Pretty Woman was one of the most celebrated of these collaborations, and his performance as Barney Thompson, the warm and supportive hotel manager, is genuinely one of the most beloved elements of the entire film. He brings such natural dignity and genuine kindness to the role that every scene he is in feels grounded and emotionally true. Beyond his work with Garry Marshall, Elizondo has had an extraordinarily prolific career across both film and television. On television, he is perhaps most widely known for his long-running role as Dr. Philip Waters on the CBS medical drama Chicago Hope, for which he won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series. The show ran for 6 seasons and gave Elizondo the opportunity to demonstrate the full range of his abilities to a massive television audience. His personal life has been marked by deep commitment and loyalty. He has been married twice, and he has spoken about the importance of family and his Puerto Rican and Basque heritage in shaping who he is as a person and as an artist. He has remained active in the industry well into his 80s and is universally regarded by everyone who has worked with him as one of the most generous and dedicated professionals in the business. Laura San Giacomo. Laura San Giacomo was born on November 14, 1962, in West Orange, New Jersey. She grew up in a close Italian-American family in New Jersey and showed an interest in the performing arts from an early age. She studied theater at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which has one of the most prestigious and rigorous drama programs in the United States. She graduated with a degree in fine arts and moved to New York to pursue her acting career, where she worked in theater and began building her professional credentials. Her film breakthrough came in 1989 with the critically acclaimed film Sex, Lies, and Videotape, directed by Steven Soderbergh. The film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival and won the Palme d'Or, which is the festival's highest honor. Laura's performance in the film was widely praised and immediately established her as one of the most interesting and talented young actresses in American cinema. She received a Golden Globe nomination for Best Supporting Actress for this role. Her work in Pretty Woman as Kit DeLuca, Vivian's sharp and funny and fiercely loyal roommate and best friend, further demonstrated her range and her extraordinary ability to bring energy and heart to a supporting role. Kit is a memorable and fully realized character in the film, and much of that is due to Laura's performance. She went on to have a long and varied career in both film and television, appearing in the television series Just Shoot Me for many years in a comedic role that showcased her considerable talent for humor. In her personal life, she has a son named Mason, who was born with spinal muscular atrophy, and Laura has been a passionate and tireless advocate for disability rights and for greater awareness and support for people living with spinal muscular atrophy. She has spoken publicly and movingly about her experience as a mother to a child with a disability, and about the ways in which that experience has shaped her values and her sense of what truly matters in life. Jason Alexander. Jason Alexander was born J. Scott Greenspan on September 23, 1959, in Newark, New Jersey. He grew up in Livingston, New Jersey, and displayed remarkable talent from a very young age, not just in acting but also in singing and comedy. He attended Boston University's College of Fine Arts, where he studied theater and graduated with honors. He is by any measure one of the most technically accomplished and versatile performers of his generation. He built his career initially in the theater and on Broadway, where he achieved significant acclaim before he was widely known as a film or television actor. He won a Tony Award for Best Actor in a Musical in 1989 for his performance in Jerome Robbins' Broadway, which was an extraordinary achievement and demonstrated the level of his theatrical gifts. His combination of comedic instinct, musical ability, dramatic range, and sheer technical skill made him one of the most complete performers of his era. In Pretty Woman, his role as Philip Stuckey, Edward Lewis's morally compromised and ultimately dangerous lawyer, was a departure from his usual comedic territory, and he handled the more sinister elements of the character with considerable skill. The role required him to be charming and dismissive and ultimately threatening, and he delivered all of those qualities convincingly. However, Jason Alexander is most widely known throughout the world for his role as George Costanza on the NBC sitcom Seinfeld, which ran from 1989 to 1998 and became one of the most successful and beloved television comedies in the history of American television. His portrayal of George Costanza, a neurotic, insecure, self-deluding, and hilariously flawed man navigating life in New York City, is considered one of the greatest comedic performances in television history. He received multiple Emmy Award nominations for the role and won a Golden Globe Award for Best Supporting Actor in a Series for his performance. After Seinfeld ended, Jason Alexander continued to work extensively in television, theater, and film, and has remained one of the most consistently entertaining and widely respected performers in American entertainment. He is also known for his warmth and generosity as a colleague and for his advocacy for various social and political causes. He has spoken publicly about his struggles with his own self-image and confidence over the years in ways that have resonated deeply with audiences who grew up loving his work. Pretty Woman, 1990, budget, making of, and funny moments on set. The story of how Pretty Woman was actually made is almost as fascinating and surprising as the story told within the film itself. The road from the original idea to the finished product that audiences around the world fell in love with was anything but straightforward, and the behind-the-scenes reality of the production involved rewrites, recasting, unexpected chemistry, nervous studio executives, and moments of pure accidental magic that no amount of planning could have manufactured. Understanding how this film came together gives you a completely new appreciation for what ended up on screen, because in many ways Pretty Woman was never supposed to be the film it became. The original screenplay written by J.F. Lawton was a very different kind of story from the romantic comedy that ultimately reached cinema screens. The original script was called $3,000, which was the amount Edward offers Vivian for a week of her companionship. But the tone of that original screenplay was far darker and far more serious than what audiences eventually saw. In Lawton's original version, the story was a much grittier and more realistic examination of life on the streets of Hollywood. Vivian's character was struggling with a drug addiction. The ending was not happy or hopeful at all. Edward did not climb the fire escape and declare his love. Instead, the film ended with Edward driving away and leaving Vivian alone on a street corner, back where she started, with no fairy tale resolution and no romantic salvation. The entire thrust of the original screenplay was a cautionary and somewhat bleak commentary on class, exploitation, and the illusions of the American dream. It was a serious drama, not a love story. When Disney's Touchstone Pictures acquired the script, they recognized something in the core premise that had enormous commercial and emotional potential, but they also recognized that the dark tone was not going to translate into the kind of film they wanted to make. They brought in Garry Marshall to direct, and worked with him, and with J.F. Lawton to completely reimagine the story. The rewriting process was extensive. Scene by scene and beat by beat, the film was transformed from a gritty urban drama into a warm, funny, and genuinely romantic fairy tale. The drug addiction storyline was removed. The ending was completely rewritten. The relationship between Edward and Vivian was developed with much greater warmth and humor and genuine affection. The character of Barney the hotel manager was fleshed out into one of the film's most important emotional anchors. The entire Rodeo Drive shopping sequence was built up into one of the most satisfying and crowd-pleasing threads in the entire story. The budget for Pretty Woman was approximately $14 million, which even by the standards of 1990 was not a particularly large amount for a Hollywood production of this ambition. The film was made efficiently and quickly, with Garry Marshall running a tight and focused set. Marshall was known for being an extremely collaborative and actor-friendly director. He believed deeply in creating an atmosphere on set where performers felt safe enough to take risks and be genuinely spontaneous, and this approach paid enormous dividends on Pretty Woman, where some of the most memorable moments in the film came directly from improvisation and unplanned spontaneity. The casting process for Pretty Woman is one of the most interesting stories in the film's behind-the-scenes history. The role of Vivian Ward was not always intended for Julia Roberts. The film went through a number of different actresses before landing on Roberts, and looking back it is genuinely difficult to imagine anyone else in the role. Several very well-known actresses of the era were considered or approached for the part, including Meg Ryan, who was at the height of her romantic comedy popularity at the time, Michelle Pfeiffer, who was considered a major star throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Molly Ringwald, who had become famous through her work with director John Hughes, Daryl Hannah, and several others. Each of them for one reason or another either passed on the film or was not ultimately chosen. When Julia Roberts came in to audition, the decision was apparently made very quickly. There was something about her that was simply undeniable, a combination of beauty, humor, emotional openness, and raw natural magnetism that no other actress who auditioned brought to the role in the same way. The casting of Richard Gere as Edward Lewis also had its own interesting journey. Al Pacino was reportedly approached for the role and passed on it. Christopher Reeve, who was still very well known at the time for his Superman films, was also considered. Sylvester Stallone was actually connected to the project at one point in its development, though it is somewhat difficult to imagine the film with Stallone in the lead role. Several other leading men were considered before Gere was chosen, and when he came on board, the chemistry between him and Julia Roberts became one of the central concerns of the production. Fortunately and famously, that chemistry turned out to be absolutely real and completely electric. There is an extraordinary amount of behind-the-scenes lore surrounding the chemistry between Richard Gere and Julia Roberts, and much of it involves moments that were entirely unscripted and unplanned. Perhaps the most famous and most frequently discussed of these is the scene involving the jewelry box. In the scene, Edward shows Vivian the extraordinary ruby and diamond necklace he has borrowed from the jeweler for her to wear to one of his formal engagements. Julia's character reaches toward the necklace, and Gere snaps the box shut on her fingers as a playful joke. The look on Julia Roberts' face in that moment, the explosive, completely unrestrained laugh that bursts out of her, the way she throws her head back and the joy just radiates off her entirely, was completely real. Richard Gere had not told her he was going to do that. He simply did it in the moment, and her reaction was completely spontaneous and genuine. Garry Marshall liked what he saw in the camera so much that he kept the take exactly as it was, and that moment became one of the most beloved and quoted scenes in the entire film. It is a perfect example of what can happen when a director creates the kind of environment where genuine spontaneity can flourish. Garry Marshall was known on set for doing everything he could to keep his cast relaxed, comfortable, and in a state of genuine playfulness. He understood that romantic comedy lives or dies on the authentic chemistry between its lead performers, and that chemistry cannot be forced or manufactured through technical precision alone. It has to be coaxed out through trust and comfort, and the freedom to be silly and imperfect without fear of judgment. Marshall would frequently tell jokes on set between takes to keep the energy light. He would improvise little moments, and ask his actors to respond to them naturally. He encouraged his performers to try things that were not in the script if they felt something in the moment, and he was extraordinarily open to incorporating those unscripted moments into the final film. There are numerous reports from the cast and crew of Pretty Woman that the set was one of the happiest and most relaxed working environments any of them had ever been part of. Julia Roberts has spoken in many interviews about how comfortable and supported she felt throughout the entire production, which is remarkable given that it was the biggest and most demanding film she had worked on up to that point in her career. She has credited both Garry Marshall and Richard Gere with creating the kind of environment in which she could be completely free and spontaneous, and she has said that many of the moments in the film that feel the most real and the most alive came directly from that sense of freedom. Richard Gere himself brought a great deal of unscripted material to the production. The scene in which Edward plays the piano in the empty ballroom of the hotel early in the morning while Vivian listens was built around Gere's own musical ability. He is a genuinely accomplished musician and has been throughout his life, and the piano playing in that scene is entirely real. It was not dubbed. It was not faked. Gere sat down at the piano and played, and Julia Roberts' character's response to hearing him play was completely natural because she was responding to something that was genuinely beautiful and unexpected. Garry Marshall apparently added this scene largely because he discovered that Gere could actually play the piano and wanted to incorporate that real talent into the film in a way that would also reveal something meaningful about Edward's character, showing that beneath the cold corporate exterior there was a person of genuine feeling and artistic sensitivity. The scene in which Vivian and Edward watch the old movie I Love Lucy on television in the hotel room is another moment that has a particularly interesting behind-the-scenes story. The warmth and ease of that scene, the sense of two people who are genuinely comfortable and happy just being together in a simple domestic moment, was very much the result of Gere and Roberts simply spending time together between takes and developing a genuine friendship and ease with each other. By the time that scene was filmed, they genuinely liked each other as people, and that real liking is completely visible on screen in every frame of the scene. The famous bathtub scene, in which Vivian is luxuriating in the hotel bathtub with headphones on and singing along loudly to her music, is another moment that became iconic largely because of Julia Roberts' willingness to be completely uninhibited and genuinely funny. The joy she brings to that scene, the absolute lack of self-consciousness with which she performs it, is something that many actresses would have found very difficult to access. Roberts simply dove into it without reservation, and the result is one of the funniest and most endearing moments in the film. The production team faced a number of practical challenges during the filming. The Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, which serves as Edward's home base throughout the film, was used for actual exterior filming, though much of the interior work was done on constructed sets. Negotiating access to the real hotel required considerable logistical work, and the production team was very conscious of not disrupting the actual operations of what is one of the most prestigious hotels in the world. The rodeo drive sequences were also filmed on location on the actual street, which required careful coordination with the city and with the various businesses located there, some of which were very cooperative and some of which were less enthusiastic about a film crew taking over their neighborhood for days at a time. One of the most frequently recounted funny moments from the making of Pretty Woman involves the famous rodeo drive shopping scene in which Vivian returns to the boutique that had refused to help her and confronts the sales staff with her shopping bags. Julia Roberts apparently found it quite difficult to get through this scene without laughing during filming, because the staging of it struck her as inherently funny in a way that kept breaking her concentration. The dialogue she had to deliver in the scene is so perfectly written and the situation so deliciously satisfying that Roberts kept finding herself wanting to laugh at the sheer comedy of the moment rather than playing it with the straight-faced pleasantness the scene required. Multiple takes were needed, and there are stories from the crew about the various ways Garry Marshall tried to help Roberts get through the scene without cracking up. The opera sequence, which was filmed partly in San Francisco, required Roberts to genuinely react to the opera being performed in a way that would feel real and emotionally true on screen. Rather than simply directing her to perform the emotional response the scene required, Garry Marshall and the production team apparently put Roberts in a situation where she was genuinely experiencing the music for the first time in the context of the actual performance setting, and her emotional response on camera was as real as it looks. The tears in her eyes during that scene are not manufactured. The film was edited by Roger Gosnell and Priscilla Ned Friendly, and the editing process was reportedly a very collaborative one in which Garry Marshall was deeply involved. The film's pacing is one of its great technical virtues. It never feels slow or padded, but it also never feels rushed. The romance between Edward and Vivian is given exactly the space it needs to develop believably, and this is as much a product of the editing as it is of the performances. When Pretty Woman was finally released on March 23, 1990, nobody was quite prepared for the scale of the response. The film opened at number 1 at the box office and simply stayed there. It earned back its entire production budget of $14 million in its opening weekend and then kept earning for weeks and months afterward. The studio, which had been somewhat nervous about whether the film's subject matter would be too edgy for mainstream audiences, was genuinely astonished by the size and enthusiasm of the response. The film ultimately earned over $463 million worldwide, making it one of the most profitable films of its era by any measure. Against a $14 million production budget, that level of return was extraordinary and made Pretty Woman one of the most successful investments in Hollywood history. The film's success created an enormous amount of follow-on interest in everything connected with it. The costume design by Marilyn Vance became enormously influential, and the fashion in the film was discussed and analyzed and admired in the same way that major runway collections are discussed. The red dress that Vivian wears to the opera became one of the most iconic pieces of costume design in cinema history, and the brown and white polka dot dress that appears on the film's most famous poster became equally celebrated. The film inspired countless fashion decisions and even today continues to be referenced by designers and stylists when discussing the aesthetics of that particular era. The soundtrack was another element of the production that contributed enormously to the film's cultural footprint. The selection of Roy Orbison's Oh, Pretty Woman as the musical touchstone of the film was a piece of inspired decision-making that gave the movie an immediately recognizable musical identity. The soundtrack album was a major commercial success in its own right, and the music from the film became inseparable from the memories audiences had of watching it. Pretty Woman, 1990, Cultural and Historical Details. To truly understand why Pretty Woman landed the way it did in 1990, and why it continues to resonate with audiences more than 3 decades later, you have to understand the world into which it was released. A film does not exist in a vacuum. It is always a product of its time, shaped by the social forces, the cultural anxieties, the economic realities, and the collective emotional needs of the era that produced it. Pretty Woman is a perfect example of a film that captured something essential about a specific historical moment, while simultaneously telling a story universal enough to outlast that moment entirely. It is a film deeply rooted in its time and yet somehow timeless, and understanding both of those dimensions gives you a far richer appreciation of what it achieved and why it matters. The late 1980s and very early 1990s in America were a period of extraordinary economic contradiction. The 1980s had been the decade of excess, defined culturally and economically by the explosive growth of Wall Street, the rise of the corporate raider as a cultural figure, the celebration of wealth as a virtue in itself, and the glorification of aggressive capitalism as the defining American value. Ronald Reagan's presidency had ushered in an era of deregulation and trickle-down economics that made the very wealthy extraordinarily wealthier while leaving large portions of the population behind. The gap between the rich and the poor in America widened dramatically throughout the 1980s, and the cultural landscape of the decade reflected this division in complicated and fascinating ways. The figure of the corporate raider, which is precisely what Edward Lewis is in Pretty Woman, was very much a real and culturally significant phenomenon of the 1980s. Real-life figures like Carl Icahn, T. Boone Pickens, and Ivan Boesky had become household names through their aggressive and often controversial business tactics, buying up companies, breaking them apart, and profiting enormously in the process. These men were simultaneously celebrated in certain quarters as bold capitalist heroes and deeply controversial in others, seen as destroyers of jobs, communities, and human livelihoods in the pursuit of pure profit. The character of Edward Lewis is clearly written with these real figures in mind, and his arc throughout the film, moving away from the destructive model of corporate raiding towards something more constructive and humane, reflects a cultural desire at the end of the 1980s to move beyond the pure excess of that decade towards something more meaningful and more grounded in human values. The film arrived at a moment when American audiences were genuinely tired of the cold and often brutal cultural values of the 1980s and were hungry for something warmer, something more human, something that believed in kindness and connection and the possibility of change. Pretty Woman offered exactly that. It told a story in which a cold and emotionally closed man is opened up and transformed by love. It told a story in which a woman from the very bottom of the social hierarchy is recognized and valued for her inherent worth as a human being rather than her social status. It told a story in which money is not the answer to everything and in which the wealthiest person in the room is not necessarily the most deserving of respect or admiration. All of these themes resonated deeply with audiences who had spent a decade being told the opposite. The Cinderella story is one of the oldest and most universal narratives in human culture. Versions of it exist in virtually every culture on Earth, from ancient Egyptian stories to the Chinese tale of Yexin to the French version by Charles Perrault that most Western audiences know best. The basic structure of the story, a person of low social standing being recognized for their inner worth and elevated through love or magic or both, speaks to something fundamental in the human desire for justice and recognition. Pretty Woman is explicitly positioned as a modern American Cinderella story and draws on the power of that archetype very deliberately. The film even acknowledges this directly in its final moments, with the closing voice-over explicitly framing what we have just watched as a fairy tale. This was not accidental or naive. It was a very conscious artistic and commercial decision to tap into one of the deepest wells of human storytelling. What makes Pretty Woman's version of the Cinderella story particularly interesting from a cultural perspective is the ways in which it both follows the archetype and departs from it. In the traditional Cinderella story, the transformation is largely external and passive. The heroine is elevated by forces outside herself, by a fairy godmother, by magic, by the intervention of a more powerful figure. She is essentially rescued. In Pretty Woman, while there are certainly elements of rescue in the story, Vivian Ward is not a passive heroine waiting to be saved. She is active, funny, opinionated, and self-aware. She knows exactly what she wants. She sets her own terms. She refuses Edward's inadequate offer at the end of the film and chooses her own dignity over financial security. The rescue, when it comes, is mutual. Vivian saves Edward just as much as he saves her, opening him emotionally and morally in ways that transform him as a person and lead him to make better choices in his business life as well. This mutuality in the rescue was culturally very significant in 1990, arriving as it did at a moment when conversations about gender roles and female agency were becoming increasingly central to American cultural life. The 1980s had seen the rise of a particularly aggressive form of popular feminism in American culture that emphasized female independence and professional achievement, and there was ongoing cultural debate about the relationship between romantic love and female autonomy. Pretty Woman participated in this debate in interesting ways. On one hand, the film's premise, in which a woman is essentially purchased and then transformed and elevated through her connection with a wealthy man, attracted significant criticism from feminist critics who saw it as a retrograde fantasy that romanticized and glamorized the sexual exploitation of women. On the other hand, many feminist commentators pointed out that Vivian Ward is one of the most genuinely autonomous and self-determined female characters in the romantic comedies of her era, that she consistently refuses to be defined by others' terms, that her final refusal of Edward's inadequate offer is an act of profound self-respect, and that the film ultimately endorses her view of her own worth rather than Edward's. This debate was genuinely interesting and genuinely unresolved, and the fact that the film generated it at all is a mark of its cultural significance. The treatment of sex work in Pretty Woman was and continues to be one of the most discussed and debated aspects of the film from a cultural and historical perspective. The film portrays Vivian's profession in a way that is remarkably non-judgmental by the standards of Hollywood films of that era. Vivian is never shamed for what she does. Edward never treats her with contempt because of her profession, and the film makes clear that any character who does treat her that way is morally wrong. The film does not dwell on the dangers and degradations of sex work, which critics have pointed out is a significant omission, but it also does not moralize about Vivian's choices or use her profession as a mark of her unworthiness. This was a relatively progressive stance for a mainstream Hollywood film of 1990, and it contributed to the film's enormous popularity with female audiences who were tired of seeing female characters judged and diminished by their sexual histories and choices. The setting of the film in Los Angeles in 1990 is historically significant in ways that go beyond the simple geographical backdrop. Los Angeles in the late 1980s and very early 1990s was a city of extraordinary and very visible contrasts. The wealth concentrated in areas like Beverly Hills and Bel Air was almost incomprehensible in its scale and excess, while just miles away neighborhoods like Hollywood Boulevard were characterized by poverty, homelessness, drug use, and social neglect on a massive scale. The city was approaching the period of extreme social tension that would explode in the 1992 Los Angeles riots, following the acquittal of the police officers who had beaten Rodney King. The social fractures that produced that explosion were already very much present and visible in the Los Angeles of 1990, and Pretty Woman, while it does not engage with them directly, is set against a backdrop in which those fractures are real and recognizable. The geography of the film is culturally meaningful throughout. Hollywood Boulevard, where Vivian lives and works, represents a very specific kind of American mythology. Hollywood Boulevard is the street most associated in the global imagination with the dream of stardom and the promise of transformation through fame and talent. It is the street of the Walk of Fame, the Grauman's Chinese Theater, the place where ordinary people come in hopes of becoming extraordinary. The fact that Vivian lives on this street, surrounded by the iconography of American dreams while living a life that represents the failure of those dreams to reach everyone, is deeply symbolic and entirely intentional. And Beverly Hills, where the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel is located and where Vivian is introduced to a life of extraordinary luxury, represents the fulfilled version of the American dream, the destination that the mythology of Hollywood Boulevard promises but rarely delivers. The film's movement between these two worlds is a movement between promise and fulfillment, between aspiration and arrival. Rodeo Drive, where the famous shopping scenes are set, carries its own enormous cultural weight. By 1990, Rodeo Drive had become one of the most famous streets in the world, a destination for tourists and a symbol of glamour and exclusivity that was recognized globally. The scene in which Vivian is refused service by the boutique staff and then triumphantly returns after her transformation taps directly into the cultural mythology of Rodeo Drive as a place where only certain kinds of people belong, and the joy audiences feel at watching that mythology punctured is a joy rooted in very real feelings about class, exclusion, and the arbitrary cruelty of social gatekeeping. The fashion of Pretty Woman became a major cultural phenomenon in its own right, and was deeply reflective of the aesthetic sensibilities of the late 1980s and very early 1990s. The clothing chosen for Vivian's transformation was designed by Marilyn Vance, and every piece was carefully chosen to tell a story about Vivian's evolution from the streets of Hollywood to the ballrooms and opera houses of the very wealthy. The red dress Vivian wears to the opera was one of the most talked about pieces of clothing in any film of that era, and the chocolate brown and white polka dot dress that became the film's most iconic image was equally celebrated. These choices reflected the broader fashion culture of the time, which was characterized by bold colors, strong silhouettes, and a certain theatrical glamour that has since become deeply associated with that specific historical moment. The film's visual aesthetic is as much a document of its era as any fashion magazine published in 1990. The music of Pretty Woman is also historically and culturally significant. The film's use of Roy Orbison's song was a brilliant piece of cultural bridge building, connecting the film to an earlier era of American popular music and romantic idealism while grounding it in the commercial landscape of 1990. Roy Orbison himself had died in December 1988, just over a year before the film was released, and the use of his music gave the film a slightly elegiac quality, while also celebrating the timelessness of his particular vision of romantic longing. The soundtrack also featured contemporary artists, and the combination of classic and current sounds perfectly mirrored the film's own position as a story drawing on ancient archetypes to speak to a very contemporary moment. The 1980s had also been marked by the devastating emergence of the HIV and AIDS crisis, which had profoundly affected American culture and society and had particularly devastating effects on communities that were already marginalized, including sex workers. The HIV and AIDS epidemic had created enormous fear and stigma around sexuality and particularly around sex work, and the cultural conversation about these issues was very present and very raw in 1990 when Pretty Woman was released. The film addresses this obliquely and indirectly. There is a moment early in the film in which Vivian and Edward discuss the importance of safe sex, and Vivian produces a collection of condoms from her boot, which she carries as a matter of professional practice and self-protection. This moment was historically significant because it represented one of Hollywood's mainstream cinema's rare acknowledgments of the AIDS crisis and the importance of safe sex, and it was handled with a lightness and matter-of-factness that avoided both sensationalism and the kind of heavy-handed messaging that can feel preachy and distancing. Pretty Woman also participated in a broader cultural moment in Hollywood history. The late 1980s and early 1990s saw a significant resurgence of the romantic comedy as a major commercial genre after years in which it had been somewhat out of fashion. Films like When Harry Met Sally in 1989 had shown that there was an enormous and enthusiastic audience for intelligent, warm, and character-driven romantic comedies, and Pretty Woman arrived on the wave of that renewed enthusiasm and pushed the genre to new commercial heights. The success of Pretty Woman in turn inspired a wave of romantic comedies throughout the 1990s, many of which explicitly attempted to replicate its formula and most of which fell well short of its standard. The film essentially redefined what a romantic comedy could be commercially, and in doing so shaped the entire genre for the decade that followed. The global reception of Pretty Woman was itself a culturally significant phenomenon. The film was released internationally and was embraced by audiences in countries all over the world with an enthusiasm that matched or in some cases exceeded its American reception. This global appeal speaks to the universality of the story it tells and the archetypes it draws on. The Cinderella story resonates across cultural boundaries precisely because the desire to be recognized and valued for who you truly are, regardless of where you come from or what circumstances have shaped you, is a desire that belongs to all of humanity. Pretty Woman told that story with enough warmth and humor and genuine emotion to reach across cultural and linguistic barriers and touch something universal in audiences everywhere. In the more than 3 decades since its release, Pretty Woman has continued to be a significant cultural touchstone. It is studied in film schools and academic programs as an example of how genre filmmaking at its best can achieve something that transcends mere commercial entertainment. It is referenced constantly in popular culture, in other films and television shows and books and songs. It inspired a successful Broadway musical that opened in 2018 and played to enthusiastic audiences, demonstrating that the story's emotional core remained as potent and as appealing as it had ever been. It is regularly revisited by critics and cultural commentators who bring new lenses and new frameworks to its examination of class, gender, sexuality, and the American dream, and each new examination tends to find new layers of meaning and complexity in a film that can seem deceptively simple on the surface. The lasting cultural legacy of Pretty Woman is ultimately a testament to the power of storytelling done with genuine heart and genuine skill. The film knew what it wanted to say, it knew who it wanted to say it to, and it found a way to say it that was funny and beautiful and emotionally true in a way that audiences recognized and responded to immediately, and have continued to respond to ever since. It captured a specific historical moment with extraordinary precision, while drawing on story traditions deep enough and universal enough to give it staying power that no amount of historical specificity alone could have provided. It is both a perfect document of its time and a story for all time, which is the rarest and most valuable thing any film can aspire to be. If this deep dive into the cultural and historical world of Pretty Woman gave you a new way of thinking about this extraordinary film, please hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you found most interesting or surprising. Share this video with the film lovers in your life because this kind of context makes rewatching a classic so much richer and more rewarding. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming content. We have so much more coming and we genuinely cannot wait to bring it to you. Thank you for being here and we will see you in the next video. Pretty Woman, 1990, ironic historical details. There is a particular kind of irony that lives inside the history of Pretty Woman, an irony that becomes richer and more layered the more closely you examine it. This is a film that the world fell in love with, a film that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, a film that launched one of the greatest careers in Hollywood history, and a film that became one of the defining cultural artifacts of its era. And yet, almost every significant element of its creation is wrapped in a profound and almost comic irony. The script was not supposed to have a happy ending. The lead actress was not the first choice. The director was not originally attached to the project. The studio was deeply nervous about releasing it. The film that was supposed to be a dark cautionary tale about exploitation and the failure of the American dream became the most beloved romantic fairy tale of a generation. The story of how Pretty Woman came to exist is in many ways a story about how completely and spectacularly wrong everyone involved managed to be about almost everything, and how that collective wrongness somehow produced something absolutely right. The first and perhaps most fundamental irony in the entire history of Pretty Woman begins with the original screenplay. J.F. Lawton wrote a script called $3,000 that was, by any measure, a serious and uncompromising piece of dramatic writing. It was dark, it was realistic, it was deliberately uncomfortable, and it had absolutely no intention of making anyone feel good at the end. In Lawton's original vision, Vivian Ward was a cocaine addict as well as a sex worker. The relationship between Vivian and Edward was transactional throughout, and never genuinely evolved into anything resembling real human connection. And the ending of the script was as far from a fairy tale as it is possible to imagine. Edward, having used Vivian for the week as originally agreed, simply drives away and leaves her on a street corner in Hollywood with her payment, returning without sentiment or regret to the life he had before he met her. Vivian is left exactly where she started, perhaps slightly better off financially but no different in any meaningful way. The message of the original screenplay was deeply cynical about the possibility of genuine human connection across class lines and deeply skeptical of the idea that love could overcome the structural realities of economic inequality. The irony, of course, is that this dark and uncompromising screenplay became the foundation for one of the most unabashedly optimistic and romantically idealistic films in the history of Hollywood. The script that was written as a critique of the fairy tale became the fairy tale. The story that was supposed to expose the falseness of the American dream of transformation and rescue became the definitive cinematic expression of that dream. Lawton wrote a film designed to make audiences uncomfortable and force them to confront an ugly reality, and what ended up on screen made audiences feel better about life than almost any film of its decade. The transformation of the script is itself a kind of Cinderella story, a piece of work that was taken from its original form and dressed up in something completely different until it was almost unrecognizable from what it had been. The second great irony of Pretty Woman's history involves the studio that made it and their attitude toward the finished product. Touchstone Pictures, the Disney division that produced the film, was not making Pretty Woman out of pure artistic conviction. They saw commercial potential in the premise, but they were also deeply uncertain about whether the subject matter would be acceptable to mainstream audiences. A romantic comedy with a sympathetic sex worker as its central character was not an obvious commercial proposition in 1990, and the studio was nervous throughout the production about how audiences would respond. There were internal discussions about whether the film was too edgy, whether the premise was too uncomfortable, whether mainstream America was ready for this kind of story told in this kind of way. The studio was, in other words, hedging its bets on a film that ultimately required no hedging whatsoever. The irony deepens when you consider that Pretty Woman was produced by a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company, the studio most famously associated with family entertainment, animated fairy tales, and the kind of wholesome, carefully calibrated content that is as far from the world of Hollywood sex workers as it is possible to imagine. There is something genuinely and hilariously ironic about the fact that the most famous Cinderella story in live-action cinema history, one featuring a protagonist who works as a prostitute and lives on Hollywood Boulevard, was produced by the company that made Cinderella. The most explicit real-world fairy tale of modern Hollywood was made by the studio that built its entire global empire on animated fairy tales. Walt Disney himself, who was deeply conservative in his personal values and famously protective of his studio's family-friendly image, would almost certainly not have approved of Pretty Woman being made under the Disney umbrella, and yet it is impossible to imagine the film existing without that Disney fairy tale DNA running through its narrative structure. The third great irony involves the casting of Julia Roberts in the role that made her one of the most famous people on the planet. Before Pretty Woman, Roberts was a promising young actress who had received critical recognition for her work in Steel Magnolias, but she was not yet a star of the first magnitude. She was one of several actresses considered for the role of Vivian Ward, and by most accounts she was not the obvious first choice. The fact that actresses like Meg Ryan, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Daryl Hannah were all considered for a role that Julia Roberts was ultimately born to play is one of the great casting ironies in Hollywood history. It is genuinely difficult to imagine Pretty Woman working with any of these actresses in the central role, not because they are not extraordinary performers, which they absolutely are, but because the specific combination of qualities that Roberts brought to Vivian Ward, that particular mixture of uninhibited joy, natural warmth, comedic spontaneity, and emotional openness, was so uniquely hers that the role and the actress seemed to have been created for each other. The additional irony is that Pretty Woman, the film that was almost not made with Julia Roberts, ended up being the definitive film of her career, the performance by which she is most recognized and most loved, and the professional turning point that transformed her from a promising young actress into one of the most beloved and highly compensated performers in the history of Hollywood. The film she almost did not make is the film that made her. The role that was offered to other actresses first became so completely and permanently associated with Roberts that it is now almost impossible to discuss it without her name. The irony surrounding Richard Gere's casting is equally rich. By the late 1980s, Gere had already established himself as a major Hollywood star through American Gigolo and An Officer and a Gentleman, but his career had been through a somewhat quieter period in the years immediately preceding Pretty Woman. He was not in the first flush of his initial stardom, and there were those in Hollywood who wondered whether his moment had passed. The film that was supposed to be made with Al Pacino or Christopher Reeve or Sylvester Stallone, and was ultimately made with a Richard Gere whose career many considered to be past its peak, ended up being the film that confirmed Gere as one of the most enduring and genuinely beloved leading men in Hollywood history and demonstrated conclusively that his appeal was not just a moment, but a lasting quality that would sustain him through decades of continued work. There is also a profound irony in the character that Gere plays in the film relative to his own real-world values and beliefs. Edward Lewis is a corporate raider, a man whose entire professional identity is built on the ruthless dismantling of companies for profit, a man who operates in the most aggressive and ethically questionable territory of American capitalism. Richard Gere, in real life, is one of the most committed humanitarian activists in Hollywood, a man whose Buddhist faith has led him to dedicate enormous amounts of his time, energy, and resources to advocating for human rights, dignity, and the relief of suffering. The actor most famous in real life for his compassion and his commitment to human values played, in his most commercially successful film, a man whose profession is defined by a complete lack of compassion and human consideration. The gap between the man and the character he played is one of the most striking ironies in the film's history. The irony of the rodeo drive sequence is perhaps one of the most culturally pointed in the entire film. The sequence in which Vivian is refused service by the boutique sales staff and then triumphantly returns after her transformation was written and filmed as a critique of the shallow and cruel classism of the luxury retail world. It is supposed to make the audience feel the injustice of being judged by your appearance and your social status rather than your worth as a human being. And it does make the audience feel that. The scene is one of the most satisfying moments in the film precisely because it validates the sense of injustice and delivers a delicious revenge fantasy. However, The profound irony is that the sequence also functions, whether it intends to or not, as an extraordinarily effective advertisement for the very culture it appears to be critiquing. The transformation Vivian undergoes through her access to Rodeo Drive luxury shopping is presented as unambiguously positive and desirable. The film critiques the gatekeeping of luxury culture while simultaneously celebrating what lies beyond those gates. It says that being excluded from Rodeo Drive is wrong and unjust while also making Rodeo Drive look more glamorous and desirable than any straightforward advertisement could. The critique and the celebration exist simultaneously and somewhat uncomfortably in the same sequence. The film's treatment of its own subject matter is perhaps the most historically significant irony of all. Pretty Woman tells the story of a sex worker with warmth, humor, and genuine dignity, and the film was enormously praised for not judging or shaming its protagonist. And yet the film also works very hard to make Vivian's story as comfortable as possible for mainstream audiences in ways that required significant softening of the reality of sex work, as most women who do it actually experience it. The original screenplay's inclusion of drug addiction was removed. The violence and danger that are constant realities for street-level sex workers are barely present in the film. The clients other than Edward are essentially invisible. The economic desperation that drives most women into sex work is present in the background but never examined with any real seriousness or depth. The film is non-judgmental about Vivian as an individual, while being almost entirely silent about the structural realities that created her situation and that affect the lives of women like her every day. The irony here is that a film celebrated for its progressive and compassionate treatment of a marginalized woman achieved that celebration partly by making her situation comfortable enough that mainstream audiences did not have to genuinely confront the realities of that situation. The film is kind to Vivian precisely because it does not show you most of what Vivian's actual life would have looked like. It is a film about a sex worker from which most of the reality of sex work has been carefully removed so that the fairy tale can function without disruption. This was not a cynical or malicious decision. It was a commercial and artistic choice made by filmmakers who genuinely wanted to tell a warm and hopeful story. But the result is a film that appears to challenge comfortable assumptions while actually being very careful not to challenge them too much, and that tension between apparent challenge and actual comfort is one of the most historically interesting things about Pretty Woman. The timing of the film's release contains its own particular irony. Pretty Woman arrived in March of 1990, at the tail end of the decade that had most aggressively celebrated the values that the film's narrative ultimately critiques. The 1980s were the decade of Gordon Gekko declaring that greed is good in Wall Street in 1987, and here was Pretty Woman in 1990 with a character who was essentially Gordon Gekko learning that greed is not, in fact, good, and that human connection and kindness are worth more than any business deal. But the irony is that the film critiques 1980s values while also being absolutely saturated in 1980s aesthetics and 1980s material aspirations. The luxury that the film presents as Vivian's reward for being recognized and valued is itself a product of exactly the 1980s excess culture the film appears to be questioning. Vivian's transformation is measured almost entirely in expensive clothes, jewelry, fancy hotels, and limousines. The film says that people are worth more than money while showing us that the good life looks exactly like having an enormous amount of it. There is also a deeply ironic dimension to the film's legacy as a feminist touchstone versus a feminist critique. Pretty Woman has been celebrated by many viewers and commentators over the years as a story of female empowerment, a film in which a woman refuses to be defined by others' terms, knows her own worth, and demands to be treated with full human dignity. And there is genuine truth in this reading. Vivian Ward is one of the more genuinely self-determined female protagonists in the romantic comedies of her era. But the irony is that the film is also a story in which a woman's transformation, validation, and ultimate happiness are entirely dependent on the choices and resources of a man. Vivian cannot access Rodeo Drive without Edward's credit card. She cannot attend the opera without Edward's private jet. She cannot be seen and recognized as worthy of respect in the hotel dining room without Edward at her side. The woman who knows her worth still requires a very wealthy man to give her access to the world in which that worth can be expressed and recognized. The film is simultaneously a story of female self-determination and a story in which female self-determination is entirely mediated through male wealth and male approval, and both of these things are true at the same time. The irony of the film's enormous impact on the careers of its creative team versus the relative modesty of its initial commercial expectations is also historically notable. Nobody making Pretty Woman believed they were making a film that would earn nearly $500 million worldwide, transform Julia Roberts into the most famous actress on the planet, reinvigorate Richard Gere's career, and define the romantic comedy genre for an entire decade. They believed they were making a pleasant, commercial, hopefully profitable romantic comedy with a slightly edgy premise that they hoped mainstream audiences would accept. The gap between what they believed they were making and what they actually made is extraordinary, and it speaks to the fundamental unpredictability of creative work at the highest level. The films that change everything are rarely the ones that set out to change everything. The film's enduring popularity in an era that is increasingly aware of and sensitive to the issues it glosses over is perhaps its most contemporary irony. Pretty Woman is regularly revisited and re-celebrated at the same time that conversations about the realities of sex work, about class inequality, about female agency, and about the romanticization of exploitation have become significantly more sophisticated and more prominent in public discourse. The film that was considered progressive in its treatment of its subject matter in 1990 is now regularly examined through critical lenses that find it considerably more complicated than it appeared to its original audience. And yet it remains beloved. Audiences know more now than they did in 1990 about the things the film leaves out and the ways in which it romanticizes a situation that for most women living it is deeply unromantic. And they watch it anyway. And they feel the same warmth and joy they always felt, and they want Edward to climb that fire escape just as much as they ever did. The film that was supposed to be a cautionary tale became a fairy tale, and that fairy tale has proven so powerful and so deeply felt that even 3 decades of increasing critical sophistication has not been able to displace it from the hearts of the people who love it. That is the great and final irony of Pretty Woman. It is a film full of things it does not say, full of realities it chooses not to show, full of contradictions between what it appears to argue and what it actually celebrates. And it is also one of the most genuinely moving and joyful and emotionally true romantic films ever made. Both of these things are completely true, and the fact that they can coexist so comfortably within the same 2 hours of cinema is perhaps the most ironic and most remarkable thing about it. If this exploration of the deeper and more complicated history of Pretty Woman gave you something new to think about, please go ahead and hit that like button because it genuinely means the world to us and helps us keep creating this kind of in-depth content. Share this video with anyone in your life who loves film and loves thinking deeply about the stories we tell and why we tell them. Subscribe to the channel right now if you have not already and make sure the notification bell is on so you are always first to see everything we put out. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end and we will see you in the next one.